let me go ahead and share. All right, who's going to be the first one to tell me they can see my screen? Let's see who it is today. Oops. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we are going over form handling today. So you remember before in HTML, a little bit of JavaScript, we had our forms, right? So this is how we can take user input and be able to do things with it, right? You may not see this every day, but forms are everywhere in a website, right? So even if I was to, let's do a new private window. If I was to go to Codio.com, right, and I wanted to log in, this right here, this is a form. If I want to reset my password, this is also a form. If I want to do a trial, this is also a form, right? I know I said it numerous times, but a form is just a way to collect data. Like all those annoying people in the corners who are trying to solicit things. I know here in the States, we have people who try to come to my house and sell me stuff. They're always carrying a clipboard or an iPad or whatever. It's a form. They're collecting and handling this data to do something with it. So before we get started, though, I know we have some warm-up questions, but let's talk about state, right? We spent some time yesterday going over state. How are we feeling about the concept? Let's not worry so much about the implementation, but when we talk about state, what are we referring to? Do we remember? And Omar, I did see your question. That's something Yvonne and Veronica will have to reply to. That is a little out of my purview, unfortunately. Okay, so this is regarding the last lesson that we did yesterday. So state is how an application is, like the status of the application, right? So we talked about state being like a light, right? So if I was to turn on, off, that state would be on or off. Maybe we have a Boolean value that says is light on. So if it's on, it would be true, off would be false, right? In the lab we did yesterday, we had some state, for example, to say, should we display all students, right? That state was a string that said all, and then we had paid and unpaid. So state is, again, it's the status, it's how an application is and the data it's controlling or needing to manage, right? So you're going to hear the phrase state management quite a bit. So the reason I bring that up is because state is going to be very important for today. Okay, so let's just kind of keep that in the back of our mind as we're working through this, right? Everything we do in coding is always building on top of something else. So it's not like we go, hey, we learned something yesterday, we're going to forget about that for today's lesson. No, we're actually going to be utilizing that state in our form handling. Okay. So let's look at this component. It's our app component. So when the button is clicked, what will appear on the page after it's been loaded? So we're seeing here button on click and it's calling toggle mode. So when the on click occurs, this event, what should be on the page? Okay, so we are saying it should be light. And that's what Sarah's saying. Do we have any other answers here? Omar votes for dark. Okay. So they did not include the solution here. I forgot that I need to actually manage. So we start with the state here as light. Okay. So what's happening is when we call this toggle mode, right? Even though it says const, it's really a function. So we're saying the new mode is going to be set to, and this is that ternary operator we're dealing with. So if mode equals light is true, we want new mode to be dark. But if new mode or if mode does not equal light, we want it to be set to light. And then once new mode is initialized as a variable, we're going to set that with that set mode function. So like GB said, light, but after clicking on the button, it will turn to dark. That's correct. So we click on it right here, should say dark. We click on it again, it should say light, right? So we have this ternary operator that evaluates whether mode equals light. And remember with the ternary operator, if this evaluates to true, we return whatever this is, or maybe we call a function, right? Otherwise, we return or execute this line of code here, okay? All right, so let's look at this question. So which component should appear on the page on load? So let's take a minute, look at it, okay? So just calling this through, we have some state that says user permission and set user permission, okay? And that use state, we're setting it to an empty string. So what should we see on this page when the app loads initially, okay? So let's start here. What should be rendered in the code that I've highlighted? Any guesses here? So again, we are evaluating the state, right? And the state is user permission. Okay, I see some people typing. Give it a few more seconds. Looks like Sarah's typing. I want to make sure they have a chance to finish. Okay. So we are going to see the sign up callout and the guest view component, right? So what we're looking at here, we remember from JavaScript, the exclamation mark, if there's just one, it's saying inverse, right? So what we'd be saying here is we want to see user permission being false or falsy, right? So we see here the user permission state is set to an empty string, and an empty string is falsy. It's pretty much the same thing as null. So because of that, we're saying if user permission is falsy, and that double and means then we're going to execute or render this code. So we see the fragment element, and then we see a sign up callout and the guest view components, okay? So after that, let's look at these two things here. Are either of these components going to render? Just yes or no question. Do we see these components rendering or not? And if so, why or why not? So let's look at this. So we see user permission strictly equals registered, and we'd see this component. And then we see user permission strictly equals admin, and then we'd see this component. So the question is user permission equal to either of these? It's not. So all we should be seeing when this renders should just be the sign up, call out, and guest view. Okay. Again, it's just an example. We're not seeing the logic to set that state to registered or admin. But if this was an actual application, this would be all we see. Okay. So when it comes to forms, JSX, we know you can use HTML and JavaScript in the same file, right? Forms, it's really not any different. So remember, forms are used to submit data. They can be. I mean, there's other things, but that's really what they're supposed to be for. And by default, when you submit a form, it should refresh the page, right? And it's prevented here, but that's what it should be doing is when you submit your form, remember back in the day, it would typically take you to a new page, right? Hey, thank you for sending the email, submitting your information. We'll get back with you shortly. So within a form, so many different inputs, right? We have label, or I guess elements. We have label, input, select, option, text area, right? So all of this is really going to be the same in JSX and React, right? The for attribute, remember, that lines up with the ID attribute, so that helps match things. And then to submit a form, we need a button, right? So without a button to submit the form, the data just sits there. So React, it's largely the same, but we are going to see some differences here. So let's take a second. What are the things that we notice right off the bat that are different compared to what we just saw on the previous screen? Can anyone tell? There's some of it here on the side, but what are you noticing here? Oops. Okay, so HTML4. Yep. So we went from 4 to HTML4, and class is the same thing, right? Class is renamed to class name. I will tell you, I struggle with that a lot because, like in Angular, it's still class, right? So whenever I come over to React, I'll put class in there, and depending on the element, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And it will yell at me in the console though, saying, "Hey, you can't do that," right? As we've seen before, as well, the event listeners are a little bit different too, right? So on click in HTML would just be all lowercase, but we've already seen it's camel case, right? So on lowercase and then capital C for click, okay? But by and large, it's pretty much the same. And that's the nice thing, right? Is we're not having to really relearn or really learn a lot of new things here. It transfers over fairly well. Now, let's look at interactive forms again. Okay, so remember we handled validation and submissions with JavaScript. So with JavaScript and HTML, right, we can set some of those constraints. So we see here in our script.js, we're doing that event prevent default, right? So it shouldn't be refreshing the page. It looks like also we are adding some elements to the DOM. So let's take a look at this. So username, relation one, favorite color is red. I hit submit, right? And then we see this little box down here. And we're using the DOM, right? We're using our DOM manipulation to do that. The page doesn't refresh. I can hit submit and we add some validation in there being like, hey, you forgot to fill out this field, right? So if I put something in there, I hit submit again. Oh, nope, I actually forgot a color, right? So some of that is in line, right? But by and large, we're able to use JavaScript to help with that validation. Um, using forms in React is going to be a little different, but it's going to be the same principles, right? And that's what I was saying earlier, where these things that we're learning now are really set on the foundation of things that we've learned in modules prior. So let's talk about controlled components, okay? So yes, you could just drop a form into React, right? You're gonna want to use those values to utilize throughout the application. And the best way to do that is a controlled form with controlled inputs. So control here means that React is going to be managing and updating those elements and the values through state. Okay. So this form control is really powerful because then we know what that form state is at all times. Okay. So instead of having to have everything more, it's still manual, but as you're going to see, that use state hook is going to be incredibly helpful here. So let's take a look at this example. Okay. So with this form, and always, if you don't see it loading, just click your terminal so it can finish running, and then we're here. Okay. So there's a single input, username, right? At the top of the component, we have our use state hook, right? With this use state hook, what is going to be the initial value for the username? Null, empty string. Yep. So if I was to put Omar in here, what do we think would happen? Whoa, right? This is what I was telling you. You don't always have to set it as an empty string, null, whatever. You can have an initial value, right? The reason that's the case, and we'll get into that here in a little bit, here in a second, but this is part of the reason why that use state is so powerful, right? So here in our input, we have two relatively new attributes for our input, okay? So we already know ID, name, type, but here we see onChange, okay? And onChange in our curly braces, remember, we need this to be able to render JavaScript inside of our HTML, or interpret JavaScript rather. We're calling this handle username method, okay? So up here on line 7, we see const handle username. We are passing in the event, right? Remember that from DOM manipulation, every element, when it fires that event, has a payload. So what we're saying is we want to console log the event.target.value, okay? And then next, we're actually going to set or update that state to be the content of the event.target.value, okay? So to really see this play out, let's open this up in a new window, okay? And I'm going to make a slight change here. I'm going to say initial username, okay? So we see here initial username. If I do backspace, we see here the console log is saying initial username, right? Because that's what we're seeing here is onChange, whenever this input changes, we want to call this method, okay? So I could remove all of that, and now it console logs a empty line, say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So it's console logging everything as it's changing because that's the change onChange event that we had with our original DOM manipulation, right? Now, the really neat thing here is the value attribute, okay? The value is set to the username state variable. This is what keeps the state and the form synchronized. So I could change this just to say value is David, okay? And if I go back into here, if I delete this, see, it's not letting me actually delete anything, right? Because that initial value is always going to be set to David. Now I can try changing things a little bit, but it's going to keep resetting back to that, right? So if I go back and I change this to, what do we have, username, then change that back to an empty string, right? That initial value is just an empty string, okay? So then yes, I will go back to that here in a second, Joseph. So onChange, right? This is something we learned in the DOM manipulation module. So when a change event is fired on an element, it should do something, right? So for us, we're saying when the value of this input changes, we want to call this method, okay? Handle username. So then handle username is saying, take that event that we're getting from the onChange. We're going to log this to the console, and then we're going to set the state of username to be whatever event.target.value is. And what we're saying here on line 20 is we want the value of this input to always be what username is. Okay, so I'll show you something here. Let's have a button. Okay, another button. We'll do this. All right. We see isn't that how did that? Why are you upset about? Okay, so here's another button. Okay, so you know what? Let's make this a little different. I'm not going to have it be a button because then it's going to want to do this. So anyway, I'm going to put a on click here. Okay, and I'm going to say handle username. It's the same method as what the input has, right? So what I could do, actually, let's do this a little bit different. Let's do update username. Okay, let's do const update username. I'm going to say set username to Veronica. Okay. So if I was to click this, my username is now Veronica. Okay. Again, and the reason for that is the value for this input is being bound. It's binding to the username state. So I could update that state somewhere else, right? And this is always going to be tied to the state we are setting up here. Okay. Does that make sense? Like why I'm able to update the username here and it would still update the value here. Right. So then I could go back in here and say Yvonne, right? And then if I click this again, it updates to Veronica. Okay, so Joseph feels good about that. How else are we feeling about this onChange and the value attributes that we have here? And I didn't mention my lizard has a ramp now, so if you see her going up and down, that's why. I'm tired of hearing her scratching out the glass. Okay, good. So we've got some thumbs up here. We've got a understanding. So if you want to go a little bit deeper about events, so React uses what's called a synthetic event. We're not going to get into that right now. You can click this link here if you want to get into that, but realistically, they're going to be almost the same between vanilla JavaScript and React, but we wanted to at least provide that resource for you. Okay. All right. So let's do this exercise. All right. So we're going to take a few minutes. I know mine looks a little different. I'm going to have to change that, my code here. Okay. So what we're going to do is, let's see, it's 29 after, so let's say 30 after. We're going to take 5 minutes. We're going to create a new input field with an associated label. It's going to be an email address. We're going to create a new state variable and function called email and set email. Set the default value to an empty string. Then we're going to handle the email updating. So follow the instructions here for step 3, right? It should be just like how we had handle username. And then on the onChange and value attributes for that input, we should be doing the same thing we did for this input as well. Okay. So let's give till 35 after. Let's take a crack at this, and then we'll come back and we'll work on this together. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So looks like Joseph, thanks for throwing that in the chat. Great job. So yeah, let's go ahead and do this. The nice thing is, in essence, I'm not saying we should just copy and paste, but we really can take we can take what was done with that input and pretty much do the same thing. So let's do that, right? I'm not against copying and pasting when it makes sense. So let's go ahead and add a new input, which if I hit refresh, yeah, it's off to the side, right? Yeah, it is what it is. So man, I always forget how strict it is with that there. Okay. So with this input, we need to make sure we update all the proper attributes, right? So we'll have ID of email, name is email, type, let's set that to email, right? That is the type there. We don't want the value or the onChange to be set to anything yet, so I'll just set that to null for the time being. And we do need a label too, right? So let's make sure we do that. We'll do HTML for email, and we'll say email address. So if I hit refresh, yeah, so we're looking like we should. That's good. But we need to take a few more steps, right? That's not all we're doing. So step 2 says we need to create a new state variable and function called email and set email. So we could go in here and say email, set email, right? And now we'll do use state, and it says to do an empty string. And now we need to create a new function to handle the user input within the email field. So the reason why we're calling this handle username or handle email, because maybe there's other things we're going to be doing in this function if the application was more complex, right? So our function name should always be as descriptive as possible. And when it comes to events, you typically want to see like handle username, set username, right? It's a verb, noun, something like that. Because again, as descriptive as we can be, the better, because there will be times where someone's looking at your code and all they'll see is a function name. And if you could make it clear, like, oh, okay, this function name is going to handle the username, right? Or this function is going to handle the username. I mean, you might not think that's a big deal, but I can speak from experience. It's really nice when I can do that compared to looking at a file and being like, well, what is this function even supposed to be doing? I can't tell right off the bat. And then I dive in and I'm like, oh, well, it's doing 500 things, right? And then I break it up. So let's make that function. So we'll handle it like how this one here. So we'll do const handle email. And then, oops, do the arrow function. So there's something I forgot to do here. What am I missing in my function right so far? The event. Yep. We need to make sure we're accessing that event that's being called. So we'll go here and let's just do set email event.target.value. Now, what you might see sometimes, and again, it's different for each team, but I would, if I know I'm only doing certain things with this event, I might go in here and say const email or like email event equals this, right? Maybe I'm using it several times, so then I would just pass in that variable. In this situation, it's not such a big deal, but depending on how your function is looking, that might be worth doing, right? So I do have to make sure I'm updating this onChange. Okay. So now I can go in here and say handle email. So if I refresh, and let's do this email, and I'm putting an email in here, that's great. But we still need to make sure that we are actually updating the value, right? So the value should be email. And the easiest way for us to tell whether that's the case is we could go here and say username. Actually, let's put this in a p tag. And we'll do p tag email. Okay. So if I hit refresh, we see username and email are blank, right? I put a D in there, put a bunch of letters, and we see it updating in real time. Right. So now we know that's correct. If I take this value out, it's not even going to let me do that. But if I do like null here, hit refresh, it's updating, right? But again, we need to make sure that we are handling it correctly. So this here is just not going to be tied to what the value is. If I updated the email elsewhere, this value would not be tied to that email. Does that make sense? So again, that's where this binding really comes into play. Okay. Great job, everyone. Let's go to the next page here. So we also are going to have select fields. Okay. So we've seen this prior numerous times, but by looking at the code here, so we see our select, okay, onChange, we're calling handle color. And the value, again, is tied to a color. So if we go back up here, handle color, we're doing the same thing. Set color event.target.value. Okay. So just again, to make this more clear, let's go here. Let's do P and make sure. Yep. So we could do color. Okay. Hit refresh. So we see nothing, red, orange, green, yellow. Right. And this is all being tied to the value is bound to the color state, and each value here has a different string. And when we call the handle color method onChange, we're taking that value and setting the color state. Okay. Now, checkbox fields, it's a little different. We're not going to use a value attribute, right? We're going to use the checked attribute. So that's going to be a true or false state. Okay. So let's look at this. We have this checkbox right here. Okay. So we have our label, the type checkbox. We're familiar with the type ID name. The checked attribute, remember, it doesn't have a value. It's checked. It's going to be set to the state of newsletter. Okay. So when that changes that value, we're going to handle newsletter. We're going to call that method, and it's going to set the opposite. All right. So with it being a Boolean, we're toggling it. So if I was to go up here and say false for that initial value, it's not going to be checked, right? Because this value here, checked, is tied to the newsletter state. So I click here, right? And this is updating the state off and on. Again, we can see that by saying checkbox, newsletter, okay? Oops. I think we have to, can't remember how we render a Boolean, and actually we'll do this. So if newsletter is true, we're going to say true, otherwise it's going to be false. There we go. Oops. So true, false, true, false. Okay. How are we feeling about that? Good to move on to the next section here. So again, everything up to this point has been a value, right? But now the checkbox is going to be a checked attribute. So it's either checked or it's not. There's no middle ground, right? You can't half check something. You can't even not touching it, right? It's not checked. It's going to be false. Okay. So if we're good to go, let's throw something in the chat and we'll move to the next section. Okay, give them some thumbs up. Awesome. Okay. So again, we're going to take, let's do about 3 minutes this time. So what's going to happen is we're going to add some state variables between the strong tags, which are down here. Okay. And that's going to be for username, email, and color. Okay, so when you type into that form, it should automatically update. If the checkbox is checked, we want to show a P tag with saying you are signed up for the newsletter here on line 98. Otherwise, it needs to be for line 99, and make sure you remove all the console logs. Okay, so it's 47 after. Let's go to 50 after, and let's see how we do. Okay, so kind of prepared y'all for doing this. So let's go ahead and give this a shot, right? So if we want to render the state in our JSX file, what do we need to be doing between these strong tags? Let's go ahead, just throw one example, whether it's the username, email, or color. What do we need to be doing? Okay, so that would be one option of username. Now, just remember it is lowercase m on the username, right? So hopefully you did it correctly and it's rendering, but it should be lowercase. So yep, we have username, we have email, and we have color, right? So if we do this correctly and we hit refresh, I should say Homestar Runner at homestarrunner at strongbad.com. Okay, my favorite color is red. Okay, awesome. So we're seeing all that, right? But now we need to be able to conditionally render our paragraph tag. Okay. So again, there's a couple different ways we could do it. I'm curious how one of you did this. Can you copy and paste your code in the chat? Let me know the solution you took. I'm going to try one here. Let's do fonts. Use letter text. Let's see if this works. Nope, I didn't want you to render yet. That's not coming out. That's fine. And looking at the chat, seeing if someone is sharing what they did here. I don't do it this way very often, but I'm curious to see if this will work. Render. Yeah, I don't really like doing things like that. So you could do it like this, where you could have a curly brace here and we're invoking this method, right? So we're saying newsletter text, and we're saying based on the newsletter, we're doing a ternary, and then we're adding this paragraph tag here, right? You could do this. I'm not crazy about that. What you could do instead is you could just have a string. Right. And then you could do what are you upset about? Oh, I need a colon here. Okay. Yeah, and I would still have to call it like this. I think that's a little cleaner, right? We're saying, hey, we want to do what's the return statement here. I personally like having a lot of this logic up here. Otherwise, it can get cluttered, right? But it looks like, Omar, you had pretty much similar to what I had above. So great job, right? And then you're supposed to remove all the console logs, right? So uh, let's see if you remember the console logs. Should that be left in an application when you turn in an assignment? I don't know if Wes brought that up, but let's just think through that. Is that something you should leave in if you turn in an assignment, or maybe you deploy an application for someone to view in the public? Do you think that would be a good idea to leave in there? So the answer I would say, and Veronica, if you have any other differing opinions, I'd love to hear. I vote for no. Because largely console logs should be for debugging, but if you're going to deploy to production or submit an assignment, you should probably be past that debugging point. You could potentially log sensitive data when you do that as well, right? Let's say you're working on an application where you're trying to take user information, you want to render certain things, right? Um, all of a sudden now you're console logging someone's date of birth in the console, right? I mean, that's not really the best approach to take. So just again, the logging's helpful. Um, it's not really something to leave in there unless it's being requested of you. Okay. All right. So we are looking at form submission, and just context here, we're going to talk about form submission, validation, state, and then we're going to get into the lab. Okay. So with controlled components, you can have direct access to the value within a form at all time, right? And then we can also do that prevent default to really, it's not just to prevent it from refreshing. We just get to do whatever we want to do with the form at that point. So let's look at this example, okay? So we have a new function that's been called. Let's click on the terminal. We'll pop up over. So it's called handle submit, okay? So we see the handle submit is being called on the onSubmit event for that form. So what happens is with this handle submit method, we see prevent default is being called. We're console logging the username, and then we set the username to an empty string. Okay, so let's think through this. We're setting the username to an empty string because we want to reset the value. But when will this actually be called? Like, what steps have to happen for the onSubmit event to be called, right? It actually has to be submitted. So let's look at what that means. So if I put a username as dmarshall3, I hit submit, it's only happening if I actually click this submit method or this submit button, right? Because down here, we see the button type is submit. Now, if I take this out, let's see what happens here. It still technically works because it's within the form. It's always good to be a little bit more verbose and specific about what you want your buttons to do. You may have different buttons, right? But again, looking at this, we are preventing the form from doing its default behavior, which is refreshing the page. We're console logging the username. I know I don't have that above. And then I have set username, okay, to an empty string. Now, what we could do, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but maybe we only want to reset the username if we have everything else, right? So that's where that state really comes into play, right? I could say if no username or no email or no color, we can't do the newsletter, right? We can't base it off of that. Then I could say return, okay? So if I hit refresh, I put my username in here, I'm clicking submit, none of this gets called, right? Because what I'm saying here is I want to make sure all of the different inputs in my form are valid. Again, we're going to get into form validation. I just want us to be thinking ahead. This is why that state's so important, right? I don't know if you remember how the form validation worked with vanilla JavaScript, but this is a lot easier. If you tie the value and everything here to that state, it just makes your form validation a breeze. So let's go ahead. This exercise, we're going to do this together, okay? So what we're going to do is it says log out all the other state variables in this form, okay? We're going to not do that. Logging, just, I think we all know how to console log something. We're going to bypass that, okay? So what's going to happen is when we submit something, right, and I'll remove this code here, we want to reset all the values back to their default values, okay? And after a submission, a paragraph element should appear below the form that says, thank you for your submission. So we already know how to set the username back to a default value, but how are we going to set the others to their default value? What are we going to need to include underneath this set username on line 18? What else do we need to include? Okay, so Omar says email, color, and newsletter. Okay, so what are we doing with those things? Do we just add those? What are we adding underneath that set username? That email, Joseph says, yep. Yeah, so we need to reset all of those values. Okay, so yeah, the easiest way would just be set email empty string, set color empty string, and then set newsletter. And what's the default value for newsletter? What should we put here? True. Yep. Okay. So great. We've done that. But we also need to make sure that we have, so let's see, everything's set default, great, but we need to make sure we add a paragraph element as well. So how could we do this, right? We could go the old HTML route and append something to the DOM, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that, right? That's the whole point of React is we don't have to do it that way anymore. So what can we do here? If we want a paragraph element to be below that form, that we'll throw it here, right? So we'll do key tag, thank you for your submission. But how am I only going to have this render once that submission's done? What do I need to do? I know it's not going to be the prettiest thing, right? That's not the point here. The point's the logic. So what do I need to add? Give it a few more seconds. A new state, yes. So this is where it could get a little tricky. Okay. So let's look at how the solution has it. Okay. So the solution says form submitted, set form submitted, right? Okay. This isn't a bad approach, but I want us to think through something. Okay. So let's do const form submitted, set form submitted, use state is false. And then in here, we do exactly what we see, form submitted, double and paragraph tag. Okay, so we see that's right. Okay, so set form submitted to true. Okay, let's make sure this works. There's going to be a problem here, and I want to talk about this. So let's do username here, email here, favorite color. I hit submit. Okay. Now I want to do my wife. Is anyone noticing what the issue is here? See a few people typing. And this is less to do with the solution having an issue, but really being forward thinking. Yes, Omar, the fact, and Joseph too, the message is still there, right? So we would want to have some kind of check to say, well, if we're going to allow them to submit again, we need to make sure we resetting all of the state, right? So I haven't tried this. I don't know if this would work. So we could do onChange handle form submission text, right? If I do that, I do const handle form submission text. We'll do an event. Actually, we don't even need the event. Oops. So we could just say if I'll just return. How could we do this? Yeah, I would have to think through how to do that. So we're going to not focus so much on that, but that's the kind of thing you need to be thinking of, right? Is with a user experience, really the best approach would be to, and it's going to be upset with me because I'm calling something that doesn't exist. We would want to think through how the user would actually do this. So either we would want to take them to a new page where they couldn't submit that form again, right? Or we could have a set timeout. So I don't know if you remember how the set timeout works. So we could do set form submitted to false. And we'll do 1.5 seconds. Okay. It's probably gonna be the easiest way to do it. Let's just add a bunch of things in here. So we hit submit and then it resets, right? It disappears. Something like that would work. But ideally, again, you would just take them to a new page so they couldn't resubmit that form again. So just as you guys are working on your labs and your projects, just these are things to be mindful of, right? So form validation, we've already touched on this a little bit. The nice thing is, we can capture we have the state of the form data at every moment, right? So now we can do live validation. It's not just let's validate once you hit submit, you could validate in real time, okay? So let's look at this example. Now we have a new set of state. We have username error and set username error, okay? It'd be amazing if you just keep running the application from page to page, but alas, we cannot. So the username error, it's included down here below. Let's find it right here. Okay. So we see a paragraph with the class name of error message and username error here. So what should happen, right? And we're seeing here, so within the handle username method, I know it keeps saying function, but it's a function in a class, so I'm gonna call it a method. We're looking here, so we take that event. So remember that destructuring, right? So we're saying const value should equal event.target. Okay. We could do it differently. You could say const username without the brackets equals event.target.value. Just depends on how you want to do it. So our check here is we're saying if value.length is less than 5, we're going to update the state of username error to be the string. Otherwise, we want to set that username error to be an empty string. And then we're going to set the username value. Now, this is always going to be called, right? We always want to make sure we're updating that value. But this check here is saying, well, if it's less than 5, we should do this. Otherwise, we should do this. Now, I know this is out of the bounds of this project, but what do you see wrong here with this validation? Or I guess, what could we do better about this error validation, right? We're saying, hey, so let's do this. I type D, right? And it says your username must be 5 or more characters. So what we could do differently is actually upfront tell them, hey, it needs to be 5 or more characters. Now, this is all in real time, so it's not such a big deal, right? But it's always good to just upfront tell people what to expect. So again, we're looking here at the input, right? onChange, handle username is always going to be called, okay? So this is because the set username function determines what shows up within the input field itself. So if you remove that, it'll let you type whatever you want. Now, the handle submit method has now been modified so that if username error is present, it's not going to let you submit your form, okay? So we can't just be like, hey, is username falsy? Because a single letter would not be falsy, right? Now we're saying if username error, you can't submit your form. So if I go down here and hit submit, you currently have errors in your form. Please fix them and then resubmit, okay? So let's walk through that again. We have our handle username method that's being called onChange, okay? In here, we're saying we have this validation we've created. If your username is less than 5 characters, we set this error message, okay? If we fix it, we're good to go. Now here, our submit validation only is checking for a username error, right? But if there is a username error, it's going to set this new form error state that we've created. Otherwise, if there's no form error, or no username error rather, then we're going to do all of this here, okay? Does that make sense before we go to the exercise? How the state is really, like, I would argue is revolutionizing the way that we handle validation here. So is this making sense? At least even to the nth degree? Awesome. Okay. So exercise time. So I'm going to walk through this and then give you all about 5 minutes. Okay. So we are going to create error state variables for the email and color fields. So follow that same pattern to check for errors. Okay. So for the email field, you should check whether or not the @ symbol is within the field. Okay. Color dropdown, you can just make sure that there's a value in there. And so if you've set the email field to be type email, that validation is going to happen. So let's go ahead and remove that. Okay. Second step, we're going to display errors underneath the input fields with the provided paragraph elements. And if there are any errors present, you should display that form error message to the user. So only once all the errors have been completed should you be able to submit your form, okay? So we look here. All right, so we have an error message paragraph here. All right, so we've created those error message paragraph elements for you. So we need to add validation for email and color, all right? And then we need to make sure that if there's any errors present, you should not be able to submit your form. So 14 after, let's come back at 19 after, okay? I could share before. All right, so let's go ahead, take a look. How many of y'all were able to do this? Can someone send me a screenshot of their form validation error messages popping up? Let's see if anyone can. If we weren't able to finish, I'm curious, was it an issue with the assignment itself? How are we feeling? Just not enough time to get that completed? Still working on it. Okay. So how many more minutes do you think? I mean, because we have a good amount of time. How many more minutes would you like? Like 3, 4 more minutes work for you? I want to make sure we have time to work on the lab later, right? Okay. Yeah, so let's do another 3 minutes. Let's just say 25 after. Sorry about that, Ivan. All right. So if you're still working on it, totally fine. Let's get started up here. Okay, I cannot seem to make the error message appear for the email. So it's Omar, keep having the default message. It's Italian, no excuses. Just kidding. So did you make sure in the HTML to remove the type email, right? So in your JSX for that input, we would want to just change this to type text, and that should change that. So that was the sub point here in A. Okay. So let's start from the top. So we want some error handling, right? So realistically, we just do what we had here. So I'm just going to copy and paste. I'll do email error. I guess that wasn't that helpful. Do email error again. And then we're going to have color, color error, set color error, use state, empty string. Okay. Make sure you refresh, everything's rendering correctly. Perfect. So now we want to make sure we're handling similar validation. Okay. So we have our handle username, right? And we have all of this here. So now let's go ahead and do the same thing for this handle email. Let's give this a little bit of space here. So we're going to say const value equals event.target. We're going to use some destructuring, and let's do a ternary. I love my ternaries. So for the email, we want to make sure that it has a at symbol. Okay, so I think there's probably a couple things we could do here, but how did you all figure out the at symbol validation, even if it didn't appear? Omar, what was the code that you used? Looks like you did value dot includes. Okay. So yeah, I think there's a couple different things we could do here. So if we did value and value dot includes an at symbol, and let's do and value dot length is less than 5. We're going to do a generic error message. Okay. So we'll do ternary here, and then we'll do Actually, I've got even a better idea. So let's do const error message equals this. So if all of that's true, we're going to say empty string. Otherwise, we're going to say you must provide a valid email address. And honestly, we probably shouldn't check the value.length. I can't imagine there being an email address that's less than 5 characters, but you never know. So the reason why I'm suggesting this is now we can just go set user name, set email error, and we'll just set it to error message. Okay, but we do need to make sure we're still setting the actual email here. Let's see if this works. Okay, so we have our username. I hit submit. All right, why is that? Yep, okay, yeah, because we have to do that. And then email. What am I missing? I know what I'm missing, but what did I miss here? I'm gonna scroll down here. I actually have to render the email error, right? Okay. Now it works. We have to render that error message. It doesn't matter if we handle all the validation without rendering it to the application, we can't see it. So again, what I did here is I created a variable called error message. So I'm checking to see if value is true, truthy, right? And if value dot includes at, well, if it's true, we don't want an error message. So let's just set it to an empty string. Otherwise, we're going to return this error message here, and then we'll set that email error, right? So either we're going to reset it to an empty string or we'll provide an error message. Okay. So now we need to do the color. All right. So let me look at yours. So what I'm seeing on yours, without being able to get into all of it, you don't need the prevent default. I don't know if that would cause an issue, but you don't need that, Omar. So, but again, I can't see your input to see whether you change that back to a text or not. So let's look at the color. Okay. I'll do, oops. I guess I really didn't have to do it that way. Okay, so we have a curly braces, and we're really just going to do the same thing, right? We're going to have const value equals event.target. We're doing some destructuring, and I want to do an error message. Now I don't need the includes, right? You must select a color. We'll do set color error. And then we need to make sure, we need to make sure we're rendering that error message down here. Okay. Now, how are we going to handle this, right? This is a little different, right? So onChange, how do you not have a color? That would be the only way, right? Is if you selected a color and then you went back to select a color. That one's a little trickier. So again, you selects like this can just be tricky when it comes to the validation. So what I would do is I'll show you what I would personally do. So we've done everything we need to up to this point, but we need to also make sure we cannot submit the form if there's any error presence. Okay, errors present. So I'm going to actually create a new function here. Okay. Oh, it wouldn't be down here. Sorry. It would be validate form. Okay. So I'm going to copy this because we do want this. Okay. All right. So let's trying to think of the cleanest way to do this. I'm trying to help you all understand clean code too, right? We can have everything here, but yeah, we're just not going to do that. Okay. So we want to check for all the errors, right? So if username error or email error or color error, and this is where I'm going to add an extra check. I'm going to say or no color. And the reason for that is if I hit refresh, let's say I take this off, okay? Let's just say no color error. I do username, email, submit. Let me submit, right? Ooh, that's not great. So again, that's where you have to kind of think through like if we do or no color, we can make sure that if nothing was actually selected, again, this is where we would want to probably take it a step forward and say if no color, set that value or set that error, right? So then we could go up into here and say if no color, set color error, you must select a color. And honestly, that's probably the only validation I would do for that one, right? Now you could still leave it where if there's a color error, that's fine. So if I hit submit, now it actually will display that error message, okay? So again, why reiterating that is because with a select in a form, you're gonna have what's called pristine or dirty state or touched and untouched. So if a form is untouched or pristine, it's not technically an invalid form, okay? That's why you have to add that validation. So when this page renders, I have not touched this select, right? Me just opening it up and closing it, that's not touching it. But if I go and make a selection, now it's actually touched. So if I go back and hit the select color, that's where the onChange event actually fires. The onChange event doesn't fire just by opening it. Does that make sense to everyone? So that's where it's really good to just have a little bit of extra validation in there. Okay. Omar, were you able to get that resolved? Did it show up once you made that change? Okay, awesome. So next page, states and collections. So yeah, we're getting a little bit more complex, right? It's getting out of hand, so to speak. But now we're going to start talking about collections, right? What we've been able to avoid up to this point is state should be treated as immutable. Immutable means it should not be changed. However, arrays and objects can be changed through bracket notation, dot notation, etc. So we're going to figure out how to actually handle this a little bit more effectively, right? And that's where I'm like, I want to show you clean code, but I don't want to get too far ahead. But this should help us to start grouping things together as a form, right? Again, you think about a form, it's a list, it's a collection, and that's how we want to write our code as well. So up to this point, can I get a thumbs up or thumbs down? Have you all gone over spread operators before? The three dots here? Veronica, do you remember if you guys went over spread operators? Looks like thumbs down. I kind of figured that might be the case. Okay, let's see if, not that I want to call Omar a liar, but let's make sure everyone else is saying no too. Okay, And so spread operator is really what the name says. We're able to spread the values in an array or key value pairs. Well, I guess values in an object, and then key value pairs. Uh, there's a couple different ways we can do it, but we're taking values from one data type, data structure, and spreading it over to another, right? It's a little odd, but I can speak from experience. I use this all the time in my everyday work. Okay. So let's look at this example. So we see here, we have an array of names, Ryan, Elena, and Aaron. Okay. So if I was to run this, we're gonna go line by line. Okay. So what is it? Node main.js. Okay. So we see Ryan, Elena, and Aaron logged. Okay. Now we see names duplicate, and all we see is ... names. So if I was to console log names duplicate, what do you think is going to be logged? So using the spread operator, we should be saying the same thing, seeing the same thing. Okay. So if I run this script, we're going to see they both have the same values. However, the arrays are actually not going to be equal. Okay. And the reason for that is they're technically two different arrays. Now, that's another conversation in itself. Okay. I don't want to get too hung up over that. But the point is, we are making a duplicate of that array of the values by using the spread operator. Okay. Now, let's look at this second example. So we see const modified names array. So we see Roger, ... spread operator names, comma, Shayla. So when we run that script again, we're going to see, we see Roger, Ryan, Elena, Aaron, Shayla, right? So we have one element in our array. We're using the spread operator to spread the elements from the other array, and then we're adding another one after that. Same thing here. So I'm going to take this and I am going to comment this out. We'll run the script one more time. So we see a person object, name is Shayla Zamora, age is 39. The duplicate, same thing, right? We see the same values. And now we have a modified person, right? So we use that spread operator to not only spread those values, but now we added a new key value pair of paid equals true. Okay. So again, the benefit here is it's a shallow copy, right? It's not a one-to-one, but if we have a bunch of data and we need to just make a copy, we just use the spread operator. It's really, really easy. And the reason why you might want to do this is if you have an application where you make a save or you're getting something from a database, right? Well, you want what was originally brought in, and maybe you want to make edits to that data, but you don't want to get rid of that data, right? You need that for reference. You want to make sure, like, hey, this is what we got initially. I want to compare it to something later. So you get that data and you spread operate. You make a shallow copy of it to use with whatever you want, right? But then you still have that original data here. Again, I cannot stress it enough. I use this when I say daily basis, like in my everyday coding. I use spread operator very often. So let's try this as an example. Okay. Oh, Joseph, question. What happens if we use two of the spread operators following each other, like name, person? Yeah, great example. So again, it just kind of depends on the actual data type, right? Now, if you're trying to put an array inside of an object without a key value pair, that's not going to work, right? But if I went down here and I said const Frankenstein equals array, right? I want to make a new array, names, then modified person. Let's see what happens. Console.log Frankenstein. Yeah, you can't, you're not going to just be able to throw that in there, right? So that's where it depends on the kind of type you're using. Now, if I had a, let's do const, I mean, really what we could do here is const names and then const modified names array, right? And if I hit the script here, it'll let me run. Now we're seeing, I mean, it's a kind of a duplicate, right? Ryan, Elena, Aaron, Roger, Ryan, Elena, Aaron, Shayla, right? So that works because you have the same data structures. So you can't just throw one into the other without knowing how that's going to play out. Okay. But great question. So this exercise here, it's 44 after. So let's give it till 50 after here. Okay. So we're going to create a new array called colors as shown below. We're going to create another new array called color duplicates that results in the following array. Okay, so you need to make sure that when you log this, you are seeing the following string here. Okay, so it says red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And then create a new object called pet, like this. And then we need to create a new object called pet duplicate that results in the following object. All right, so let's come back at 50 after and we'll go over this together. Let's go ahead. Thank you. So let's go ahead and do this, right? I'm going to comment all this code out. So we're going to create a new array called colors. And here, let's just copy it, right? We'll leave less room for error. But we want to create a new array called colors duplicate. So const colors duplicate equals, okay, so we want it to be red, orange, yellow, green, and then blue, indigo, violet. Who would like to share their answer and how they were able to do this? All right, so I want to make sure that I can console.log. Oh, you threw it in the chat. Awesome. Good job, Joseph. So you did red, spread operators of color, blue, indigo. Yep, you missed the violet, but I know it's kind of like a scroll bar there, but that's exactly it, right? So we go here to our array, we do red, ... colors, and then we do blue, indigo, violet, right? And then I could do console.log colors duplicate. So if I run that script, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Good job. Okay. So then we want to create a new object called pet. So called pet. So yeah, you copied that. All right. And then we want to create a new object called const pet duplicate, where we see the same thing, right? But we take Louis, age 3, cat, and we also add an owner and breed. So like, okay, so we do ... and then we put pet. Now, Joseph, you put ... owner. So, okay, I see what you did there. You created a new variable called owner. That would be one way to do it. Yep. So I'm going to do it kind of how it's asking us to do it here, though. So then I would just say owner, Shayla Zamora, and then breed. I'm assuming that's a soft J, the Havanese. I'm a reptile guy, not a dog guy or cat. So we look here, I need a console log pet duplicate. And there we go. Name Louis, age 3, kind cat, owner Shayla Zamora, and breed is Havanese. So let's look at this with our React form, okay? So the spread operator is really going to help us out here. So if we look at this example, we can see some errors. So we have const errors, set errors, use state, and we have an object of username, email, color, and form, right? Everything is a empty string. So what's going to happen here is when we look at the handle username, so if value.length is less than 5, we're going to set those errors, right? So we're going to pass in all of the errors that we already have. And now username is going to be your username must be 5 or more. Otherwise, we're going to set errors to be a spread operator of the errors, and username is equal to empty string. Why do we think in this situation we want the spread operator, right? Wouldn't it be fine just to set username as the error, right? That'd be fine, don't you think? Well, let's see what happens. All right, if I remove that, let's do an error here, right? Let's do an error here. And if what just happened? See, we have to have that spread operator because we want all of the existing errors to still be prevalent. If we don't have that spread operator, what we're doing is we're saying all of the errors should just be this, right? So if I go back and I include that spread operator here, let's do bad email, bad color, and then I add my D here. See, all of those errors are still present because we're taking that array, or that object rather, of errors, and we're making sure we're including all that, right? Because let's say the error goes away for the username, that's great, but we don't want to reset any other errors here either, right? So again, that spread operator makes a copy of the existing object and it adds a new key value pair. But if that key is already within the object, it's going to be overridden by that new key value pair. And then we see down here in our HTML, we see errors.username, right? So we get to display the text from the error object. Okay, does that make sense before we look at this in a little bit more detail? All right. So now we can go a little bit further than this, right? Now we're going to collect all of the form data within an object. So yes, it is still going to be complex. It's going to be a bit more organized too, right? So we have our errors object, and now we have our form data object, right? So now what we can do is whenever the username is updated, look at what we're doing here, set form data. So we're doing the spread operator, right? We don't want to get rid of all the other data, but now we're saying the username key value, or the username property, should be set to value. In the email, it's the same thing. Email should be set to value. Color should be set to value. So now in newsletter too. So now for the handle submit, what we can say is, well, if there's any errors inside of that object, now we can set the form error from the property there, right? And now we can reset all the values in our object. And now we can set all the errors in our object, right? It's categorizing everything and keeping it organized. The object allows us to group the relevant data together. And all we have to do to access any of that is just to use the dot notation, right? So for the value here, we just want to say it's form data dot username, because again, we're setting that form here, that form data here in our state. It's instead of having 8 different, because if you think about it, look how many we have: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If we did this outside of an object, that would be 8 different sets of use state that we would need. Okay. So what we're going to do is it's 57 after right now. Okay. So we kind of made this a little weird here on the guide. So what I would like to do is, for the time being, We're not going to look at this portion here. This is just talking about passing the prop drilling, kind of what we did yesterday. I want to make sure you guys still get a few more minutes to take a break, and then we're going to talk about the lab. Okay, so it is 58 after. Let's come back at 3 after, and we'll go over the lab and make sure that you all have enough time to ask any questions while Veronica and I are present. Okay. Before we get into the lab, thank you. Before we get into the lab, I just kind of wanted to briefly touch on what's happening here, right? So this is what we saw yesterday with prop drilling, right? So in our app component, we are passing that add sign up to list function from the form component. Okay. So we see here, add sign up to list, right? So we see set signups and we're passing the signups array here and new sign up being whatever ends up getting changed. So again, I want you to look at this when you have time, because this is what we learned yesterday, but we're just passing that state into a child component, but we're using a form, right? So it just keeps everything cleaner, keeps it a little bit more organized. So for today's lab, we are going to update the student list application to include a working form. Okay, so when the form is properly submitted, a new student should appear in the list. And if there are any errors in your form, those errors should appear at the bottom of the form above the submit button. So we see here, preferred name is required, something's wrong with your submission. Okay, so this is going to require doing the use state and understanding how forms work. So I'm going to walk through these steps and we'll give you a little bit of time before we go. Okay, so this is going to be the time where if you have any questions, please make sure let's address that now. You were given this extension to take care of this, which is great, but we do not meet. I will not meet with you on Thursday. So please let's knock out any questions now. So following steps are going to help you build this application. Use them if you feel lost or if you're struggling with a feature. As always, you have that solution. Just please use that as needed, right? And so a couple different solutions, there's always multiple ways, right, to solve a problem here. So don't feel like if you solve it a different way, you're wrong. It's just maybe it's not the best way, or maybe it is a better way. We can talk about that. So before you do anything, look at the application, see how it works. You need to get comfortable and identify what is actually happening. If you just rush in and you start coding without even knowing what you're working on, you're going to be wasting a lot of time. That's just the truth of the matter. Okay, so understand how these components are working. We see here the student list. We're passing the students down as a prop, and we're passing in the array, or sorry, the profiles array that we have here. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is in the form component, okay, we're going to want to use state in here. You're going to want to have two state variables being form data and errors. Each one should be an object. So we want to set keys within the object equal to the form fields. So if you go back to the example, the exercise, or I guess the example we just looked at a few pages ago, that is going to help you on your path here, right? Is having an object for your values and an object for your errors, and you're going to have state for each of those. You're going to want to have a function that's going to handle the input for the preferred name, right? This function should do the following. Should have a parameter of event to keep track of that event. It should check the value of the form field. And if the length of the inputted text is less than 2 characters, you should have an error. This is very specific here, okay? Less than 2 characters. It should set the value of the preferred name within the form data object. So already what we've seen before, right? Someone inputs something into the input, they type text in the input. We should be doing the onChange event validation. If it's not correct, add an error. Otherwise, you're good. Reset any potential errors there, okay? We want to connect the function you just created to the appropriate input element. We want to make sure we're setting the value attribute equal to the appropriate key within that form data object. Make sure it works. This one here is important. If you skip over this and you start doing everything else and nothing's working because you didn't test it, you're going to be in for a bad time, right? So test as iteratively. As you make a change, test. As you make a change, test. So you want to make sure you repeat this process for the other two form fields. So you should have surname and current grade, okay? So again, preferred, surname, current grade. Once the form is appropriately showing errors, create a submit handler function. Okay, so within this function, you should only be able to submit the form if every field has a value and there are no errors. If the form is invalid, show a message to the user. If the form is valid, clear the form. In step 9, your form is working, but the data is not being added to the table on the left. So you're going to need to create a new function within the app component that uses that set profile state function to update the list of profiles. Pass this function down to your form component and call it within that submit handler function. Okay. So again, to reiterate, everything we're doing here, we have seen prior. Okay. We're not asking you to do anything that hasn't been presented to you already. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, I'm going to run the solution here. Make sure this works. So preferred name is David, Marshall. I have an F, right? So we see here exactly how it should work. And this is something you can do too, right? And I don't know if this has been brought up prior, so let's bring it up now, is if you have the solution here and you want to see how it works, you can always just change the directory and run that application, right? So again, we're seeing here, if I put a single letter, it says preferred name is required. The error message goes away when there's 2 letters, right? Surname, I'm just going to leave blank. I'm going to put an A here. I hit add student, right? And we see that nothing was added, but it is still showing the preferred name error message. And it is saying that something's wrong with the submission, right? So there we go. DDDD has an A, whereas I have an F. I don't know how that works. Okay. So again, this is where if you're lost, go back to a previous exercise. Go back to your examples. Like I promise you, everything that you need to solve this lab and to learn what you're doing is going to be provided in a previous example. Now you're going to have to change the data. You're going to have to change the structure a little bit. You're going to have to do some creative work in your brain to translate a concept from one exercise to another. But it's all here. It's all purposely there so that you can consult those things to proceed. Okay. So we've got about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Whatever questions you have, let's go ahead and answer those. Otherwise, we can give you this 15 minutes here to go ahead and get started on the lab. Okay. Because I know sometimes it's hard to find all the time